is, in my mind, on the cutting edge of what I expect to be the next revolution in our field. For the past decade and more, it has been ACEs that have shaken our world and increased our understanding of childhood adversity and trauma. This has helped to shape our response to child abuse and neglect. But the next revolution is hope. Health outcomes from positive experiences and the exploration of PCEs, PCEs, or positive childhood experiences. This work takes the protective factors work that many of us, maybe most of us, have embraced to a new level. Dr. Sege is professor of medicine at Tufts University School of Medicine, where he directs a new center for community engaged medicine. He is a senior fellow at the Center for the Study of Social Policy, which has been the foundational place for development of the protective factors framework and much of the work that we have engaged in over many years. Which is in Washington, D.C. And Bob also serves on the boards of our colleagues at the Massachusetts Children's Trust and at our national affiliate, Prevent Child Abuse America. And although I'd much rather he was here with us physically, please welcome Dr. Bob Sege to Idaho by the magic of Zoom. All right, Bob, thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Roger. It's really a pleasure to be here. I've met Roger many times in many different meetings over the past few years, and although we're doing this on Zoom, I am still very much looking forward to coming to Idaho and visiting. So it's been a few years since I've been there. So what I'd like to do today is we're going to talk with you about hope, or healthy outcomes from positive experiences. And in addition to myself, my colleague, Dr. Dina Burstein, and our research staff, Chloe Yang and Lauren McCullough, are on this meeting, and hopefully you'll get a chance to meet them. I know you'll get a chance to meet Tina a little bit later. For more information, you can see our website. What we're doing today is continuing on the path to hope. And I think that everyone here, or most everyone here, has heard about strengthening families. And the way I think about it is what a strong family does is it helps create those positive childhood experiences that we all rely on to become healthy adults and to become resilient to all the rest of the things that may happen to us during our life. And I say continuing on the path to hope because Idaho leads the nation in hope. The Idaho Children's Trust several years ago developed a handout for parents called Healthy Outcomes from Positive Experiences based on the very beginning of this project. And I have to say that I've been inspired by Roger and by the Idaho Children's Trust in how quickly and completely you all have grabbed onto this concept. So today, we're going to go through this and really dig in and understand how we know about healthy outcomes from positive experiences, what that means, and how we can incorporate it into our daily life. In doing this, I'm going to use a way of thinking that we get from Jeff Lincoln back at the Montana Institute. He calls it the science of the positive, and it describes a cycle of transformation. So we're going to begin with the spirit. Why are we all here? Why are you all spending your day learning about this? And what's our goal? And we know that good intentions don't do enough. We need to find out what works, what doesn't, how to learn about it. This is where science enters in. And knowing a lot doesn't really matter unless you act on it. So the next phase in the cycle of transformation is action. And finally, we'll have an opportunity by the end of this session this morning to talk about reflection and return and what we're getting out of it. I won't be spending a lot of time during most of the talk on coronavirus, but we will end up in the last section of this morning. I'm really talking about how hope influences the way we look at COVID and families' responses to it. So let's dive in. Before we dive in, I want to give you two quick definitions. First of all, hope is healthy outcomes from positive experiences. What are healthy outcomes? So health is not just not being diseased. Health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being. and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. And this comes both from the World Health Organization and from my mother, who always told me I should live in good health. And this is what she meant. And then I'm going to talk about positive experiences. And for a moment, you may think that, oh, Dr. Bob invented all this stuff. This is old hat. So when we think about it, think about things you already know. Attachment between parents and their infants. Conversation, which begins when the child smiles at you at about 6 weeks and continues forever. The development of literacy, the development of independence, which happens really noticeably in childhood twice. Once during toddlerhood, when the toddlers invent the word no, which is a very powerful word, and again, when we're teenagers. And finally, what we need to become adults is that sense of mastery, that we do things well. The reason we're doing that is because hope can provide a language to talk to each other. It's based on strong science. It honors human dignity, equity, and empathy. What we're trying to do, and we are doing with the help of the Idaho Children's Trust and others around the country, is shift the paradigm towards a strength-based approach, one that infuses positive experiences in the prevention, mitigation, and healing from ACEs. And we describe the kinds of positive experiences as building blocks because these are flexible and you can build what you want out of them to adapt your program and adopt them so it makes sense to you, the families, and communities that you serve. So we're going to go through this using the Science of the Positive framework, spirit, and then I divided science into old science, which is about trauma, new science, which is about positive experiences, and action, which describes hope or healthy outcomes from positive experiences. So we're going to start with spirit. So I think that when we wake up in the morning, and I mentioned in the chat that a few times a week I get up really early and with a couple of friends, we swim across a pond and watch the sunrise. And I loved Roger's poem when he started. We really are at the dawn of a new era. Things have changed, and we're seeing families who are both stressed and resilient, and ourselves. We're discovering ways that we can adapt to this really bizarre world we're living in. And holding that in mind and knowing that what's happening is just beginning to unfold. So you want to start, and I'm going to ask Carrie to help us with the Mentimeter. We'd like you to do is Carrie's going to open a Mentimeter for you, and then we'd like you to enter one word that describes why you do the work you do. Everyone on this call from the Children's Trust has decided that they want to work with children and families, often in difficult circumstances. So put a word in the box about why. And I'm going to turn it over to Carrie to tell you how to do that.
Great. You have two ways of getting into the Mentimeter. We're going to see the word cloud being developed in front of us. So I'm sharing my screen. You should see, there you go. You can enter the code there at the very top. You see it's 4537184, or you can click the link that I put into the chat. Lovely. There you go.
This is beautiful. You have 264 participants, so let's keep going.
That is cool.
So Roger, have you typed your word in yet?
I did. It's not winning yet, but it's it's up there. There it comes.
There you go. So while people are doing this is so beautiful, because what we're seeing is each of us came today with our own reason for being here, with the reason that we decided to spend a day together doing this. And I want you to look around the virtual room and see the spirit and values that everybody has, all the others in this group have as well. And I'm going to read a few of the words, but keep typing. And I'm hoping that Carrie will be able to save this for us later and give it to Roger as a as a gift so you can put on his wall. People do this work because of hope and love, because they want to change the future, compassion, support, passion, empathy, to educate, because this work has impact, because they can make a difference, because we're parts of communities, because they want to turn around things. They want to have some influence. People feel like they're together. They're thinking about their own well-being. Peace came up. For many people, this is a calling. This involves healing from all the things that have happened. Happiness, justice, learning, babies, love babies. So I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint, and I'm hoping that Carly can share this image with us later. So I guess I go back to share screen.
Yes.
Great. So what I want you to understand from that is you're in a group of 266 people with the same set of values, people who want to make the world better, who see possibilities for change, and have deep feelings about empathy and about the work we do. So with that, that was very sweet. And I also want to go to another element of spirit, and you'll forgive me, I'm a doctor, but it's going to get a little grody. So I'm going to tell you, and where we're going towards with this is the idea that part of the spirit that we're doing is that human beings have an almost unlimited capacity for healing, and specifically healing in our brains. So long before I was born in the 19th century, there was this man. His name is Phineas Gage. He was a railroad supervisor. And unfortunately for poor Phineas, while he was supervising railroad workers, this spike that he's holding in his hand went through his head. It obliterated his frontal lobes. And as a result, he had one of the world's first lobotomies. And he had an extreme personality change. He had been a sober, responsible person. And then afterwards, he was fitful, irreverent, grossly profane. And his contemporaries said he had the opposite of his previous personality. And from this, the scientists of the time determined that prefrontal cortex functions in planning, moral judgment, and emotional control. So why am I telling you a horrible story like this? The answer is because if you fast forward a decade, within 10 years, he had recovered from his trauma. And there he was. He became famous in the United States, so he moved to Chile, where he became a stagecoach driver. And he drove stagecoach routes from Santiago to Valparaiso, which is a long trip. It's about 10 or 11-hour trip by stagecoach. It goes over the mountains. In order to do it, you have to pick up your passengers, collect their fares, keep them happy across the mountains, drop them off where they go, and then feed and groom the horses and get ready for the return. But what his doctor said at that point was he was in enjoyment of good health with no impairment of his mental faculties. And I'm holding this in mind because if you think about it, when we talk about people who've had trauma, particularly when we talk about ACEs and toxic stress, we instantly go into this mode of brain damage. The architecture has changed, all of these problems. But I'm going to put out to you that if Phineas Gage could recover from having the part of his brain that's in charge of emotional control and be able to hold down a job and live a decent existence, people who've had psychological trauma also have that ability to recover. And now fast forward 150 years, and we can tell what happened with poor Phineas. And that is that his brain, actually different parts of the brain took over functions. And what you can see, and I'm sorry, this is a little, well, it's very colorful, so we'll just go there. When I move my right hand, it's my left brain that's controlling it. And so you can see that when this person was using something called a functional MRI that lit up when the brain was working, the other side of the brain, so this would be the left brain if they're moving the right hand, all lit up, and this right-hand side was kind of quiet. Now imagine this person had a stroke, and maybe they actually did. What happened is, after months of rehabilitation, you can see that the area where they had the stroke and the brain cells died is kind of dead looking, right? It's not lighting up. But look what happened. Another part of the brain took over. So what we know now in the 21st century is that we have a lot of brain cells. We have probably around 2 billion brain cells, and it's hard to count them all. Each of those can have up to 10,000 connections, and each of those 10,000 connections can have another 10,000 connections. So for those of you who are good at math, you'd realize there are a lot of cells and a lot of connections, and through experience, we can rewire. So I'm telling this story because what I want you to remember from this, not the grody part about the spike and the brain damage, but that brains can heal, and that the work you're doing, and we saw that in the Mentimeter, you all know from maybe your own lives, but certainly from your work, that healing is possible. And that's the spirit that the Healthy Outcomes from Positive Experience framework comes from. So brains can heal, but we all know, and I think that Roger mentioned ACEs, but just to do a temperature check, we're going to start with a Zoom poll. And I want to ask everyone, how much do you know about the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study? Nothing? A little? More than a little? I'm well versed, or I'm an expert? And Bob, you should sit down and I'll take over. Okay. So this is great. There are a couple of people who haven't heard about ACEs, but most people have heard or would like a little brush up. So we're going to do a little brush up, and I'll try to go through it quickly because so many people are already aware of it. But I think that historically, we understood ACEs and became trained, in adverse childhood experiences and in trauma-informed care before we learned about hope. So we're going to close out the sharing of the poll results, and I'm going to go through ACEs really quickly. The Adverse Childhood Experiences Study was done in the late 1990s and published in 1998 by Felitti and Anda. And what they did was they asked 17,000 members of a health maintenance organization, all of whom were employed, most of whom were white, about their childhood. And they asked about 10 different kinds of adverse experiences, 3 that were abuse, physical, emotional, sexual, 2 that were neglect, physical, emotional, and 5 kinds of household dysfunction, mental illness, incarceration, intimate partner violence, substance use, or divorce. And they found that these were associated with adult health. In the decade or two since that study was published, we've come to see that this is profoundly affects our health. This was a 2019 report by Melissa Merrick and her colleagues at the Center for Disease Control. 20 years later, there's a lot more data about ACEs, and I want to walk you through the right-hand column to show you how much chronic disease in the United States is attributed to ACEs. And I'll skip over the statistics, partly because I don't understand them, actually, but I believe her and her colleagues. The 12.7% of chronic heart disease in adults can be attributed to ACEs, 1 in 8. And chronic heart disease is the most common chronic disease in the United States. Asthma, which begins in childhood usually, 1 in 4 adults with asthma, that can be attributed to adverse childhood experiences. Depression, the most common mental illness in the United States, and as we say in Boston, wicked common. 4 out of 10 cases, 44% of depression can be attributed to ACEs. 1 in 4 people with a heavy drinking problem, 23.9%. And people who fell out of their education before high school, 5% of those can be attributed to the adverse childhood experiences they had. So this says that what happens in our childhood is super important, and the children who are abused, who are neglected, who have family dysfunction are more likely to be ill physically and mentally as adults. And then that study was published in 1998. And then in 2017, Wendy Ellis, Bill Dietz, and their colleagues published something called the Adverse Community Environments. And what she pointed out was all of these ACEs that we talked about maternal depression or mental health, physical and emotional neglect and abuse, divorce, mental illness, incarceration, homelessness, domestic violence. Those are all things that people experience as children, but many of them are associated with troubles in their community environments. People living in poverty, people who face discrimination or xenophobia, communities that are disrupted and not cohesive. If children grow up and teenagers facing a lack of opportunity or mobility, if their housing is not very good or not available, or there's violence at home or in their community, these are the circumstances that set us up for adverse childhood experiences. So the 21st century has seen a commentary on ACEs where we also look at social stress factors like poverty. And the Strengthening Families framework talks about concrete supports in times of need. The experience of institutional racism or historical trauma, think about the Native American population, war and migration. Many people who've immigrated to the United States immigrated because of really dire circumstances where they were living, and the neighborhood effects where they're living now. So what happens if you think about it is that we can change how we look at things, because if you only look at risks, then you're taking people, classifying them according to the top of this tree and saying, we're going to identify your problem, and here it is, it's an individual problem, without looking beneath it. So when we look at this, we can change from providers defining problems, which means that we define the problems, and the people may or may not think those are the most priorities. And there's a hierarchy, right? Like we ask people about what's going on, and then we develop views of people and families as broken, rather than people and families who are resilient in the face of adversity. This creates the possibility of othering, so that individually we can say there, but we can say you're like this, I'm like that. But as a group, there's a bunch of information about the kinds of implicit biases that we all carry with us. And overall, one of the things that we're trying to counter with hope is blaming individuals for current and historic problems. So how does this work? It works because we begin by appreciating strengths. Families are not broken. They may be facing challenges. And if we talk with parents and kids and understand what they've overcome, that provides the basis for joint decision making, so we can understand that the families are experts in their circumstances and navigating their lives, as well as things that we know, which is virtually all parents really love their kids and would do almost anything for them. And by doing this, we understand that some of the problems don't need professional services. Some of them need things that we'll be talking about later, like connections to their own communities, supports, and the ability for people to engage. So what we're hoping to get for with hope is a new form of partnerships and lasting relationship. So here's where we are so far. We know from science that adverse childhood experiences can lead to changes in our brains and bodies called toxic stress, and these lead to poor health outcomes like chronic heart disease, depression, asthma, drinking. But I want you to take a moment now, everybody, all 267 people. Think of someone you know. It could be someone you see in the mirror in the morning. It could be somebody else who had 4 more ACEs but came out okay. And for many of us, the person who comes to mind may be someone we admire. So when you hold this person in mind, when we talk about how other experiences affect the brain, think about that person. What else happened to them? Were there positive experiences in their lives that made them come out okay? From this basic knowledge, and I'm going to go out on a limb and say, I hope and I believe that each of you can think of one such person at least. We know that positive experiences affect brain development. And from that personal lived experience, I want to dive into the science that can explain how that works. Now, the poll, how much have you heard about PCEs, or positive childhood experiences? I love watching the numbers tick up. We won't have sports anymore, so it's the closest I can get to excitement on the screen. Okay, look at this. This is a way above average crowd. I started out by saying how you guys have already talked about hope in your work. But look at this. You already know more than a little, but have a lot to learn. So today, for the next segment, we're going to go behind the science. So everybody's going to be a PCE expert. And I'm so sure of that, I'm not going to ask you again. Okay, so let's go back to the slides. So what happened was, I mentioned that the ACEs, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, was done in 1998 of employed people in the Pacific Northwest. Patients answered questions about their childhood, and this was correlated with their health status. We undertook, and this was with Jennifer Jones and Jeff Lincolnback and Christina Bethel, we added questions to a routine survey done in every state, including Wisconsin, called the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System. In Wisconsin, they asked about ACEs, as well as the 7 questions I'll tell you about positive childhood experiences. And our results, published last year, looked at the effect of these positive childhood experiences on adult mental health. So here are the questions. The positive childhood experiences, or PCEs, that we asked about, there were 7 of them. Remembering your own childhood, how often as a child did you feel able to talk to your family about feelings? How often did you feel your family stood by you during difficult times? How often did you enjoy participating in community traditions? How often did you feel a sense of belonging in high school? How often did you feel supported by friends? How often, particularly as a teenager, did you have at least 2 non-parent adults who took a genuine interest in you? And did you feel safe and protected by an adult in their home? The statistics at the bottom are from Dr. Bethel, and she was able to, with her team, sort out that these 7 items form a scale. So you can have a PCE score just the way people have an ACE score. We published this in the Journal of the American Medical Association, their specialized journal in pediatrics. It came out about a year ago. I'm going to show you some of the results, just in case any of the people here don't happen to read that every time it comes out. So here's the first result. If you compare Wisconsin adults who had 6 or 7 of the 7 possible childhood experiences to those who had only 0 or 2, there was a 72% lower odds of having depression or poor mental health associated with these positive childhood experiences. Those who had a middle number of childhood experiences, 3 or 5, had a middle result. They had a 50% reduction in adult mental health problems, including depression or poor mental health. This is great. Positive childhood experiences matter. And there's probably nobody who would tell you that those 7 things aren't good for you. But the next slide is going to show the rub, and this is what we're so excited about. And that is that if you look at people who had ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and then look what happened if they also had positive childhood experiences. So I'm going to walk you through this graph. It's a little bit complicated, but nevertheless, here it is. So the yellow line on top represents people in Wisconsin who described themselves as having 4 or more ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. If they had that many ACEs and no 1 or 2 positive childhood experiences, nearly 60% reported depression or poor mental health. And then if they had all that adversity, but they also had those positive childhood experiences, only 21% had depression or poor mental health. And if you think about it, you had a really difficult childhood if you had 4 or more of those 10 categories of abuse, neglect, and family dysfunction. Well, we see a middle number of positive experiences had a middle result. The other lines, this one is those who reported 2 or 3 ACEs. For example, they may have been sexually abused and neglected. They had a similar effect from positive childhood experiences. And those who had only 1 ACE, for example, those whose only problem during childhood was they were physically abused. They still had high rates of depression and poor mental health if there weren't also counterbalancing positive childhood experiences. So think about it. So I want you to think about this in relation to 2 things. I asked you earlier to hold a person in your mind who had had adverse childhood experiences, but was now okay. If you think about that person, maybe they had some of these positive childhood experiences. Maybe that's why they're okay now. And if you think about poor Phineas Gage, something happened to him that enabled him to heal. The brain is capable of healing even after really bad stuff happens. There's a lot of evidence about how this works, and I showed you the MRIs of a person with a stroke. So stroke recovery is a clear example of how our brains can rewire themselves. Brain changes have also been observed with other positive experiences, and those positive experiences include things like learning to read. So when adults learn to read, the brain channels that run from our visual cortex to the part of the brain that helps us think in words, you can actually see on MRIs those connections get strengthened. And I know earlier we had a wonderful session of calming ourselves and centering. And what we know, and Julie probably knows this herself, is that when you train somebody to meditate, that causes changes not just in their function, but also in their brain anatomy. You can see a different kind of connection form. There have also been some studies, famously in Japan, where they look at people's recovery after trauma. And in Japan, they looked at a bunch of people after a massive earthquake, and they could see that in the year following the earthquake, as they recovered from that trauma, that parts of their brains grow. So this is called brain plasticity. And it doesn't mean plastic like what you wrap your sandwich with, but it's plastic like the ability to mold and change and grow. So our brains aren't just fixed and sitting there, they're always able to grow. And these biological mechanisms of action have even been broken down onto a cellular level. So I went through some of these, sorry about that. What I want to show you is that the more you use a brain pathway, the more you can develop what we call superhighways, right? So if you have a little path that's gone by once or twice a year through the woods or the wilderness, it's a little hard to maintain it. If it's a path that's like I-90 that goes across the state that a lot of trucks and cars go on, it's going to be well maintained and very fast. So we know that the same thing happens in the brain. So if you look at these 2 neurons, those are the cell bodies on the top, and they're reaching down to their axons. Those are the things at the bottom. And you can see a little signal going down. The one on the left is like a little path through the woods. It can send a little signal, and sometimes it makes it all the way to the bottom. It travels pretty slowly. The more that pathway is used, those little hot doggy things, they're called oligodendrocytes, and they insulate the brain fibers. So that fiber, called an axon, now has a bunch of insulation around it. So look how the signal passes fast and it passes well. So the other one kind of diminishes as it goes down, but in these insulated pathways, the signal does not get diminished. So those oligodendrocytes form insulation around the brain, forming superhighways in the brain, and that just comes from experience. So what the neurologists say is that cells that fire together wire together, so that if that connection is used a lot, the brain develops new, fast wiring between connections. This is how growth and healing works. So we know from our own personal experience, if you thought about the person in your head, someone who had adverse experiences, we know from surveys that adults who had adverse childhood experiences, if they also had positive experiences, they developed new connections. We know from looking at people who had strokes or poor Phineas Gage, they would develop new wiring. And we know from people who learn to meditate or learn to read that they develop new wiring. So now it's no longer 1998 when we know that adverse experiences affect us. It's now 2020, and we know that beneficial experiences affect us as well. So here we know. And there was a study published in 2016 by Tomlinson that looked at these cells, these oligodendrocytes, the hot doggy things here shown schematically along the neuron. There are certain kinds of experiences that promote oligodendrocyte development: exercise, social interaction, environmental stimulation. And for those of you who've heard of strengthening families, you can certainly think about how this might relate. So one of the family strengths is social connection, right? So having that actually changes us deeply. It changes our brains. At the same time, we know that there are experiences that can suppress oligodendrocyte development: social isolation, sedentary lifestyle, and environmental deprivation. So one of my really interesting study is they looked at scientists who spent a winter in Antarctica. And apparently, if you spend the winter there and you look out the window, all you see is white. And if you want to interact with people, you have like your dozen or two people in your own station and you kind of get bored of them. There's not too much to do. You can see brain changes in those brilliant scientists who are doing experiments all winter because they're not exposed to environmental stimulation. Their social interactions get stale, and their exercise, rather than running around and playing in the snow where it's like minus 1 billion degrees, become things they do on machines. So think about that. Even the most highly functioning people need to have those experiences, and if you suppress them, their brains change. So here's the new 21st century diagram. We still know that adverse childhood experiences can lead to toxic stress and can lead to poor health outcomes. But we also know that positive childhood experiences can prevent adverse childhood experiences. So for example, we'll get to this in a minute, some of those experiences that I mentioned are relationships. So the relationships we have with our parents can prevent abuse from happening in the first place. They can block the way this pathway goes from adverse childhood experiences to changes in the brain and body known as toxic stress. And even after toxic stress has happened, these positive experiences can promote healing. Positive childhood experiences promote resilience. So I want to just pause for a moment. I've gone through a lot of science, and I'll do another little Zoom poll here. How are we doing on the science? And I tried to go through it as thoroughly as we can in the time available, but let's see how we're doing. Well, I'm delighted that most people think they're good with this and they can begin to see how it fits, and pretty much everybody wants to know more about how it fits. So we're going to do that right now. So thanks for sharing, and I'm delighted that we've made something clear, because this is sort of the basis of knowledge, just the way when we learned about adverse childhood experiences and toxic stress and trauma-informed care, it made us better at our work. What we want to do now is turn the switch and say, well, now we've learned about positive childhood experiences. What do we do in our own work and in the programs we work in to take this incredible science and make it relevant to our work and to the families and communities that we serve? So up until now, we've been looking through the rearview mirror. If you ask adults what happened to them as a child, and that's kind of interesting if you're an academic, because you can say, well, that happened to you. Now, let's go to action, because we want to move in a forward direction, because we're not museum keepers who just take a bunch of people, put them in little categories and say, oh, too bad or too good or whatever. We want to do now is look towards the future. And we don't have really crystal balls to look towards the future, which is just fine because we want change, we want transformation. Think about the word cloud that we did at the beginning, how change was the big word. We don't want to accept the future, we want to make it better. So what we're doing is we're going to build something out of the scientific knowledge that will really matter for us, for our clients, for our communities. So another study that we published in 2017 with my friend and colleague Charlene Harper Brown, also from the Center for the Study of Social Policy. What we did there is we looked at programs for children and youth that had been published as effective programs. They're things that actually made a difference for people. And here's what we found, that there were 4 categories of experiences that the children and youth enrolled in those programs had that we believe made the difference. So if you look across these programs, these are the 4 kinds of experiences. And we'll go into this in more detail in the next session, but I want to just sort of name them as a place to start. Oops. First of all is relationships. So for all of us, the first foundational relationship had was the moment we were born and we opened our eyes and there was our mom, and often there was mom's partner or dad or somebody else. And these relationships that we had from the moment of birth form the foundation for other relationships that we're going to have. As we grow up, we have relationships with other children. And I mentioned earlier, when we did those surveys, the importance of having other adults who are not your parents, who believe in you. Those relationships also matter. And how do those relationships occur? Relationships occur through interaction, interactive activities. One building block of hope are these positive foundational relationships. A second one is the environment. Children need to live in safe, stable, and equitable environments. And these are places where they can live, learn, and play. So if you think back to the survey I did, one of the questions was, did you feel safe at home? Very profound, seems a simple question, but a very profound question. Much of this research has come through work on what's now called a positive school environment. So we used to think about bullying being a child behavior. And then as it was looked into, it turned out that the whole school environment mattered. How does the principal treat the teachers? How do the teachers treat each other? How do the teachers treat the students? Those are the things that go down and affect how children treat each other. It's one example. And then engagement. How do we engage in our families, in our communities, in our societies? So thinking back to when we were really little, when mom told you to go bring the diapers so she can change a little sister's diaper, you were important. She couldn't do it without you, or at least you thought so. Many school teachers will have kids do classroom chores so they develop a sense of community. And then for preteens and teens, having that sense of engagement that they're involved in their community, it could be through politics, it could be through sports, it could be through arts, singing, all of those things. That sense that other people depend on you, that you matter, is an important quality and a kind of experience you need to have for optimal growth. And finally, the fourth bucket that we found, which we now call a building block, are opportunities for social and emotional development. And I say opportunities because the main way this happens actually is by playing with peers. So I don't know if anybody was ever a kindergartner or has kindergartners at home, but when you watch them stand out in the playground, often what you'll see is they're standing around, maybe holding a ball or something else, and they're arguing about the rules. And this may be kind of weird as an adult, but think about it developmentally. What they're learning is social emotional development, because they've just realized that rules come from somewhere and they can make them themselves. And then think later, collaborative projects in school, team sports, art, music, plays, all of those things require collaboration and social emotional development so that you can play your part. So those are the building blocks. And in the second session, we'll have a chance to dive much more into those. When we talk about integrating hope into our work, another way to think about it is the actual process of work that we do. So we meet our patients and clients at an initial encounter, the first time we meet them. Then we often have interactions with them, and there are ways to think about people when you interact with them that hope helps. And finally, we're trying to set cultural norms amongst ourselves and with people we serve. So we talked earlier about hope is involved in creating an equity-focused agenda so that we can do collaborative problem solving with our patients, clients, families we serve. And that comes from the sense of admiration and empathy. So I want to dive into the initial encounter first. So what I'd like you to do is have a look at this cartoon. And this cartoon has a lot of things going on in it. And we're going to use the chat box to get some ideas of what you're seeing. So first, if you can enter into the chat box any risk factors that you see, just go ahead and type them in. So look at this picture, and I don't know, maybe things are perfect, maybe not. But if you see any risks, please go ahead and type them in. Oh my God, there are a lot. Smoking, bugs, cords, chemicals, physical safety issue, TV not stabilized, baby on the floor, negligence, baby not receiving anything, someone smoking, there's a power cord, the adult doesn't appear to be safe, there's cleaning supplies, there are holes in the wall, mom is on the phone, not talking with the kids, there are tripping hazards, the food is not very nutritious, the playpen is there, there's screen time, the TV is not anchored, there are bugs, there's damage to the sheetrock, the baby's being ignored. Someone says there are effects of sexism and classism. We can talk about that. So now what I want you to do is, boy, open mattress, adults unengaged, cleaning products. There's so much going on there. So type a few more, think about those risks, and think of anything you haven't seen. No, I can't tell you which television channel is on. Sorry. Okay, now take a big breath. And what I'd like you to do is look at that same picture and try to identify any protective factors that you see in the picture. And they're pouring out. They're all together. There's spirituality. The parent is in the room. There are books. There's some supervision. There's a pet. Child's not on the floor. Child is in a pack and play. One child has glasses. There's the things you need. There's a playpen. Mom is present. They're reading. Cigarettes on an ashtray, which I guess is good. Faith, family, pets, food. Children are within sight and sound. There's a roof over their heads. Because they're cleaning supplies, though they're a danger, it means someone's cleaning. Someone wants to know if there's poop on the floor. I hope not. It's possible. I think that's supposed to be a mousetrap. I hope. There are clean dishes stacked in the kitchen. Someone's cleaned up. There are clothes. Everybody's wearing clothes. So look at this. So here's a family. They obviously get health care because the child is wearing glasses. Someone pointed out mom is paying electricity bill, so the TV's on. She's been reading a book. There is food. There are cleaning supplies. And they're connected. that many people notice the spiritual picture on the wall, so maybe they're connected with a spiritual opinion. Somebody, thank you, Rob, notice there's a second home, there may be a second adult, and that you can see that there are boots that probably don't fit those little feet that mom has, and another jacket. And it looks like nobody is crying or screaming, although it's hard for me to hear what the baby in the playpen's doing, but maybe not. And the boy could be reading a book because there's a book in front of him, or he could be playing with an Xbox. It's a little ambiguous, isn't it? So look at these. So this is the complexity of life. And I want you to reflect. And again, we're going to go to another Zoom poll. And I want you to think, which is easier? Which was easier? Like, which was the natural way of thinking for those of you who've been trained in various ways? To see risk or to see protection? And answer honestly. Great. So we can see is that for most everybody in the virtual room today, it was easier to see risk factors than protective factors. Now, part of that could be our dispositions. I don't know you all well enough, but partly it's because of our professional training, right? That we are trained to identify problems and look for cures for those problems. And as the more we work and the more we do that, the more automatic and easy that becomes. So this exercise is really about a change in mindset. And we'll talk about it at the end of today, is how we do that. But I want to give you a little more insight into how our brains work. Type 1 thinking is fast, intuitive, unconscious thought. It happens in everyday activities. It's effortless, and it's based on our training and experience. So I don't know if you remember when you first learned to drive a car, and it was a little overwhelming with all the stimulation that came in and trying to figure out what to do, what to pay attention to, where all the pedals were. And then before you know it, it became effortless. So you can drive someplace that you've driven a lot, and when you're done, you don't even remember the drive because your mind was literally elsewhere. Type 1 thinking is really important to us. We need to have that fast, intuitive, unconscious thought, or else we would be so bogged down. So those are our ancestors who didn't have that, who they saw a saber-toothed tiger approaching the cave, and they said, it looks like it could be a saber-toothed tiger. Maybe it's dangerous. I wonder what we should do about it. Maybe we should form a committee and think about it, or get together and discuss what we can do about saber-toothed tigers. Those people, I'm just going to go right out there and say they probably did not have a lot of offspring, because the people who had type 1 thinking and said, saber-toothed tiger, put that boulder in front of the cave, run to the back, they produced offspring, right? Because they didn't even think about it. They knew it was a threat. They knew how to act. It was fast, unconscious thinking. Type 2 thinking, and this is probably what you did when you were looking for protective factors, is slower, it's more calculating, and it's more conscious. It's how we solve a problem. So if the type 1 thinking doesn't get you where you need to be, then you move to type 2 thinking to really be more thoughtful about what's going on. It's hard. It makes you sweat. People don't like to do it. Who likes to think about that? Because it's a little frustrating, right? Because you think you ought to know the answer, but you don't. And it's what, and on the other hand, if you're a child and everything is new, or you're an adult, to see something novel, it can be really exhilarating, because type 2 thinking is what happens when you see something you don't expect and you have to puzzle it out. So what I want to do for a moment is just sort of digress from the talk about hope and talk about what's going on now in the world. First of all, Type 1 thinking is when you meet someone for the first time, you will subconsciously make a quick judgment about them. And that's important in some ways, but it also opens the door for implicit bias, for judging people based on other attributes of them other than who they really are. And for those of you who are interested, there are online tests you can take that show how each of us, and pretty much every single person, whatever we think of ourselves, because this is the way we think, we have biases, and we look at someone, we have feelings about whether things are good or bad. And that's kind of okay in some circumstances, maybe not. But also professionally, we need to step back and recognize that we need to get more information than we got literally in those first few milliseconds of seeing someone's face. So in doing assessments, we need to move from type 1 thinking to type 2 thinking. So what we're talking about here for hope, when we do this assessment, is to train ourselves to be as easily available to identify strengths as we were to identify risks, recognizing that every person and every family we encounter will have a mix of both. And in the work we'll be doing in the later sessions, we're talking a lot about how this all works and how we rebuild our training to make this happen. So specifically, one of the things that many of us do is we identify risks, and we do it either by this type 1 thinking or by something that's almost type 1, which is using evidence-based screening. So anybody who's ever administered a screening test for domestic violence or depression, if you just rage, what can we do for the reactions? Give me a thumbs up on the reactions if you've ever been trained to do evidence-based screening. Okay, so I see quite a few thumbs going up there. Or you can click yes if you like. Okay, so this is what we do, right? And then so we find those things, and then we try to refer them to the resources. But if we're able to switch and see what the person brings into it and provide support. And I'm going to give you one more example before we move on. And that is when I used to work at Boston Medical Center, which is a safety net hospital in the city of Boston. And in our obstetrics department, they had a program for women with substance use disorder, specifically people who had trouble with opiates like heroin. And they would enter into the program, and they would be helped to get into recovery, whatever treatment they needed, or to stay in recovery, and given both OB and substance use care through their pregnancy. And then eventually they had a baby. And as a pediatrician, I got to see some of those babies. And what I trained myself to do is, before meeting these families for the first time, to remind myself that here was a mother who had decided to carry the baby to term. And realistically, I bet that a lot of them had friends, neighbors, relatives who told them that because of their problems, they had no business bringing a baby into the world. They had rejected that. They had entered into or stayed in recovery through their pregnancy, and that's not easy. And finally, when the baby was born, they had advocated for themselves to keep the baby, and successfully advocated with our child welfare system. So when I opened the door, I already thought about this mother as a woman who was strong and persistent, who had a really serious problem, but had made her way through. She had kept the baby, she had stayed in recovery, she had advocated for herself with DCF. What this meant was that I was able to enter that room with an appreciation of some of the struggle that she'd been through, and able to ask her questions like, what kept you going? How did you do this? So it could provide understanding and support. This is really different than either labeling and judging, oh, you're the mom with who's the addict, or not talking about it because we're afraid to enter the subject. So doing that enables understanding and support that can help people heal. And this is what we're talking about, is training ourselves, to see the strengths as well as the problems that are so obvious. So I want to close there. Before we close this first session in the keynote, I have a few moments. If there are questions you want to type in the chat box, that would be, you're welcome to do that. And then we'll describe what the next stage are going to be this afternoon.
There are already some questions in the chat. Let me see if I can get back to them through the,
Okay.
Let's see. Is there an effort to cross-reference ACEs with COVID-19 outcomes? With such disproportionate outcomes for Black and Brown Americans, I've been really curious about whether anyone is actively looking at this intersection.
That's a great question. So we're all concerned about that, right? Because traditionally what ACEs do, ACEs can result from those social stresses. Families are unemployed, their economic problems, all those things that we're seeing. But we're also seeing that many families may have two adults at home. Because of the bump in unemployment insurance, many families were buffered, at least for a while, from the worst effects, economic effects. So we've undertaken a survey funded by the CDC together with Prevent Child Abuse America and the American Academy of Pediatrics. So we're going to ask 3,000 US parents about what's going on at home, what they're experiencing. We'll also ask them about their childcare situation, employment, and those sort of things, because there is a vigorous debate going on about what's going on in families. One thing we know is that in most of the United States, child abuse reports are way down. And the two possible explanations for that, there are many possible, two of the possible explanations are, one, maybe it's not so bad, and maybe having less time pressure because of jobs and school, more together time, has reduced child abuse. The other possibility is that children simply maybe being abused and have nowhere to go and nobody to see it. They're not seeing their teachers. They're not seeing their early childhood educators. They're not even seeing their grandparents. So we're worried about it and concerned. There's a lot of risks that are going on because of the disruption in COVID. So we're trying to find out. And the first wave of surveys should go out in a couple of weeks. We'll be doing it 3 times over the next year. So I'll hold on to that question and I'll be able to give you results ideally in time for Thanksgiving.
I'm trying to get back to another one. I was trying to get, okay, sorry. Ding, 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 ding. Oh gosh. There's a question that Dr. Omar Shamim asked, and maybe Omer, you could actually ask your question because it's a little doctorish question.
What I asked was, of course, MS in multiple sclerosis, the myelination of the nerve is affected, and also the oligodendrites are disappearing. So the graph or the figure you showed was, of course, the pathway developed through positive childhood experiences. So has PCEs has something to do with that? I don't. It's a very deep clinical question, so I don't know.
Yeah, what we do know is that certain kinds of experiences lead to increased myelination. So when I mentioned that there's an association between adults learning to read and brain changes, what you're really seeing is myelination of the connections between the visual cortex and Broca's center, between the speech cortex. And so we are seeing that. And of course, diseases that cause demyelination can be devastating to go from that rapid transmission of nervous signals to very slow and often ineffective transmission. So we know that a lot of stimulus in the paper that I mentioned, and you guys will get access to these PowerPoints later, showed some of the factors that affect oligodendrocyte development. That's a really good question. And You know, I'm obviously bridging different areas of knowledge because I don't think they randomly assigned children to have positive experiences or adverse ones in studying the oligodendrocytes. There's a bunch of leaps of faith that have been made between the basic science and the observations that we made through surveys.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's a great question.
Somebody else had a question. I'm wondering about research on virtual social interaction with COVID. Does it still stimulate the brain?
I hope so, because we're doing it today. It's a really good question. There's so much we don't know. And all I can say is in 1918, they didn't, I don't think they had Zoom then. So who knows what happened. And that was the last time there was a pandemic. But my gut sense is it really does help. And I feel like I've connected with family and coworkers reasonably well after the shock wore off. And there's a group in Oregon called Rapid EC, and they're doing weekly surveys of the American public. And one of their reports showed that during the first few weeks or month or two after the shutdowns associated with the pandemic, there was a dramatic rise in depression and anxiety. And for most people, people recovered and depression and anxiety levels got back to normal after a few months. And in response to an earlier question in the chat box, the exception were people who lived in low resource communities or themselves had few resources. So they may have been working in essential jobs or had limited internet. So there's a lot of stuff that suggests that having this ability to connect virtually really allows us to adapt and recover. It's a great question, and there's no obvious answer other than we're all 266 of us are here today hoping that it helps.
Bob, there were several comments. Just to let everybody know, we are recording this, so it will be available, and the PowerPoint will also be available. I know a number of people have asked about that, so we will have all of those materials available. We're recording every session other than breakouts, and so those sessions will. So you will have access to them, so that if you go to a workshop that you didn't go to, you will be able to, you may be able to also watch that too. There were many comments about how important this work was and how excited people were to hear about it. Yeah, I think those are generally the comments since we're coming up on the break time. Does anybody have any final anything? We'll give somebody a special shout out. If there's somebody who's got something, go ahead and open up your mic or go and open your mic and say it. Let's see. This has been the best. I just got that. The best is in capital letters too. So
great.
All good.
And I think it's so important to remember we do have the power to change our mindset, to have that paradigm shift. We can focus on the positive, and it's powerful to realize how important that is and how productive that will be for our families to learn that shift also.
Thank you, Renee.
All right. So Bob, do you want to say anything in closing? Oh, okay. Yes. Good point.
So we have two breakouts coming up. One led by Dr. Dina Burstein. Dina, if you're available, you can unmute yourself and say hello. Also a pediatrician with a lot of experience in training who's been part of our HOPE team since January. She's going to lead a discussion about bringing hope into direct service. So do you want to say a word or two, Dina?
Sure. Hi, everybody. As Dr. Sege said, my name's Dina Burstein. I'm the HOPE Project Director. I've been with Bob at Tufts and the HOPE Project since January, but before that, I did a lot of work in unintentional injury prevention research and outreach. And before that, I was a primary care pediatrician. And I am really looking forward to this breakout session this afternoon. What I'm hoping to do is not spend a lot of time talking, listening to me talk, but really get down to some small group discussions and some sharing in the bigger group of how we're going to actually put this HOPE approach into practice with patients and clients. So looking forward to seeing a bunch of you shortly. Thank you.
Just to remind you that Dina is in Boston, which means it's afternoon, but for us it's still morning, so don't take a long break. You're going to need a short break. It's fine. It's fine. This time travel is not easy.
Yeah.
Bob, do you want to do a little more explanation, I think, of each of those so that I think people are getting it, but there's quite a few people not joining, so maybe it's not clear.
So the one Dina's going to lead is really for people who interact directly with patients or clients, and they're going to go through the initial encounter, interaction, talking with someone who's experienced trauma, but also bring strength, and then how you create positive experiences and change the cultural norms within which you work. The second breakout session is for people who are managers or organizational policymakers and really thinking about what resources are already available, what sort of training and other changes in practice will be necessary to allow the frontline people to know about hope and to use it in their practice. And this will be based on looking at resources that support each of the 4 building blocks of hope and dive more into that. Both of them will be highly interactive, so you'll have a chance to work in small groups, and you'll be expected or hoped for to leave with a plan of action, something that you're going to do yourself in the next 90 days to bring hope into your work. And we realize that for some people with direct interaction with clients, they want to use it tomorrow with their clients. Other people who are involved in training and organizational practices really need to think a different way about how you set things up to support people to do this in their work. Both sessions are going to end with some practice and exercises that will help you develop hope as type 1 thinking, things you can do every day, so you get that repetition in your brain to develop the superhighway that will allow you to see the positive as almost as rapidly, or hopefully eventually as rapidly, as we see the risks. And just to reiterate, they're both there. You would be foolish to work with people and not see the risks and problems. But equally, what we're thinking with hope is it's also a problem if you don't see their resilience and strengths. So those are the 2 sessions, and Carrie is going to tell you how to get to them, or it's on your Padlet. Will be in your chat box soon. And it looks like there's a good number of people at each one, and they're both going to be wonderful. And Roger, I don't know if they're going to be recorded because there's a lot of interaction, so they may not be recorded, but we will share all of the resources that go with each one with you, so the people who choose one or another. And those of you who are from the same agency may want to split, so one of you can go to each one and compare notes later.
Hey, Carrie, let's go ahead and record them, and if they're too chopped up, we'll not put them out. How about that?
Sure thing.
Because I know both you and Dina are presenting as well, or at least setting things in motion, so that'd be great.
Okay, that'd be super. So I think at this point, what we'd like to do is you did your poll, and now it's time to take a stretch break, and you can return at 10:45, except for Dina, who needs to return at 12:45.
Wait a sec, 10:35, I think.
10:35.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Or 10:35, 9:35 Pacific, for those of you up north.
Okay.
We're in many time zones here, so.
Okay. But I can't, let's see, can I change the slide, or do you just have to listen to Rod? Let's see if we can change the slide.
I'll put down I'm also going to put up a countdown. So I'll
Great.
have a 15-minute countdown, or do you want me to do it so you come back?
No, 15, let's do 15 minutes. I think people probably need that. And then come back at, now it's confusing time. I was going to say, come back at 10:30 or 10:32 or something if you are interested in a little bit of self-care with Julie.
So is Julie going to be at this URL and then they go from there to the breakout rooms?
Yes.
Great. Okay.
Is that right, Carrie?
That's correct.
Okay, perfect.
Great. So I'll look at this. I'm going to be back with Julie, and then I'm going to go to my breakout room because I really enjoyed that.
Enjoy your break. All right.
Okay. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Roger.
Bye, all.
Bye-bye.
All right, should I go ahead and start? I wanted to mention really quickly, in case folks don't know, there's this great exercise developed by Maureen Durning and Jane Zink with the strong curriculum called Keep Change Add, and it's a learning helper tool. And I just made a quick worksheet for myself, and I just made 3 columns: keep, change, add. And at the end of every workshop or learning moment, you can take a self-reflection moment and think about, you know, what did I learn? What did I remember from this workshop that I want to make sure I keep? What's something I want to change, and what's something I want to add to my practice, or, you know, to my knowledge base about this topic. So I thought I'd share that really quickly because it's helpful to me and can apply in any learning situation. So that was a great talk by Dr. Bob. Thank you so much. And I do want to add, yes, meditation can change the brain. It does help many, many people. It's not necessarily for everyone, but I do, it helps me a lot. And I certainly teach pretty much everybody I know how to meditate if they're open to it and it helps them. I'm going to share with you a meditation, a quick version right now to help us get back into our bodies and regulated. And if you aren't going to join me for that right now, here is a link to a Google Drive with a lot of different resources in it for self-care. And if, oops, that's to Maureen. Whoops, sorry, Maureen. Now you have it too. I'll do it to everyone. And there we go. Did it go? The links are in the chat in the Padlet. Okay, I guess my share isn't working right now. I'll share it in a second. So in this Google Drive, though, there's a Google Doc with a series of links in it, and one of them is my SoundCloud, which has my meditations pre-recorded on there, along with a lot of other great resources. And I don't know why I was able to share a moment ago, and now I can't. Okay, so I'll put it on the Padlet. So,
Is it not to everyone, or?
Just to everyone. I just keep hitting enter, and it's not going.
Okay, all right.
So I don't know. It's probably my computer. I need to update it. Oh, it thinks I want to do a spotlight search. That's it. That's what was going on. There we go. There it is. So let's take a quick moment and bring things down to center again. So this meditation is called the 3 Bs for 3 different areas that we can access self-regulation within ourselves. So 1 B is for breath, 1 is for body or progressive muscle relaxation, and the last one is for brain or positive self-talk. So if you want to take a moment and get comfortable in your seat, you can close your eyes if you'd like, or just look down. And let's begin with a couple of breaths. And let's imagine for a moment that your attention is like a flashlight. And the abbreviated version of this meditation is that this flashlight has power to relax any muscle it shines upon. So let's use this flashlight of attention, of relaxation, and go ahead and just scan the body with it while taking some deep breaths and just noticing where you might be holding unnecessary tension in this moment. And allow your attention, your flashlight, to shine upon those areas. And with the next exhale, release that tension. And in a patient way, in a curious way, just moving to the next set of muscles that might hold some tension at this moment. And let's take that flashlight now and broaden it, kind of like a scanner, and rest it at the top of the head. And I'm going to do a 5-second countdown, and you can go ahead and move from the top of the head at 5 to the bottom of the feet at 1, allowing relaxation and compassionate attention to just wash over the muscles of the body. So let's take a breath in. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And when you're ready, come back to regular awareness and know that you can do this 5-second self-care progressive relaxation countdown whenever you'd like. Enjoy your next workshop. Thanks, everyone.